Hola, buenas tardes a todos amigos. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Pues soy Plácido Doménech y hoy tenemos la continuación de un Inside X muy interesante que empezamos el sábado, pero al final el domingo no pude continuarlo. Y he empezado la semana con un non-stop increíble. La cantidad de cosas, bueno, ya he anunciado muchos de los contenidos de esta semana, que va a ser épica, pero casi he anunciado algunos contenidos de hasta 3 semanas, porque los tenía en la cabeza, porque hay que planificarlos, porque hay que agendarlos con la gente de temporadas anteriores, gente nueva, a ver si traemos también gente un poquito más joven, si se animan, porque cuesta un poco más, pero en definitiva, bueno, un montón de contenidos y programas. Y estoy overflow. Realmente, bueno, esta semana seguro que habrá 1 o 2 programas por día, viernes incluido, o hasta que me dé la energía. Hasta que me dé la energía. Y no sé qué pasa, quiero verlo. No sé si X, hay algún problema con X. No sé si X está caído. Pues a ver, no. Vale, vale, ya está operativo. Porque me ha asustado, porque yo digo, uy, cuidado con esto. Vale, un segundín, porque me he emocionado con lo de los problemas de X y no he compartido el vídeo. Entonces, bueno, voy a dar un poquito de tiempo para que os vayáis conectando y así me da tiempo a rápidamente compartir el enlace del directo. Bueno, muchísimas cosas, muchísimas cosas. A ver. Bueno, está el tema, como me ha dicho hoy mi amigo José Musás, Plácido, ya se nota, ya se nota el miedo, se nota el cambio, se nota la aceleración. La gente está más nerviosa de lo normal, y no me refiero a la gente que no conoce nada, sino a gente que, bueno, trabaja en el sector tecnológico, programación, en el mundo en general. Se nota que toda la aceleración va a tener y todo el desarrollo de inteligencia artificial, incluido un avance de DeepSeek V4, que parece que ha habido una filtración que supera a CloudOps 4.5 en open source. Pues parece que todo el mundo ya tiene asumido que esto de la inteligencia artificial es lo que contábamos siempre en xHUB.AI, ¿no? Pues un cambio de era, un cambio de paradigma, forma parte de nuestro propósito, de nuestra evolución. En las redes, los cortos de SaaS Apocalipsis han tenido un impacto también brutal. Ya no leo mensajes, no sé, porque a lo mejor hay 200 mensajes en un post. Entonces, bueno, es que no me da tiempo a contestarlos. Si sois algunos de los que me estáis escuchando ahora, algunos de los que escribís en comentarios, pues bueno, disculparme, pero cuando son pocos, pero cuando son muchos ya llega un momento que es imposible contestar a todos. Vamos, bueno, esperad un momentín, porque sí que quería poner, sí, exactamente. A ver, porque resulta que ya ha salido una noticia sobre Cloud y me he quedado loco. Pues mira, no está ahí. ¿Por qué no está lo de Cloud aquí? Ah, aquí sí que está. Pues yo no sé si esto será cierto, ¿no? Bueno, vamos a ponerlo, vamos a leerlo, ¿no? Vamos a coger todo esto como además tiene relación porque, bueno, estamos hablando de Anthropic. Vamos a ponerlo. Vamos a poner ese post, que lo quería haber puesto en las slides. Pero bueno, lo ponemos directamente en X y esto. Vamos a verlo. Vamos a ver qué dice. Bueno, es última hora. El Pentágono ahora llama a Cloud una amenaza para la seguridad nacional. Después de la Constitución, después de... a ver, un segundo. Después de todo y... ¿qué ha pasado ahí, no? El Pentágono integra a Cloud en sistemas militares a través de Palantir. En enero, Cloud fue usado en una extracción de Maduro. La gente fue fumada. Bueno, fumada. No sé, exterminada o algo. A ver la traducción. Fumada. Smoker. Bueno, no sé. Smoker, temas militares. Gaseada será. Un ejecutivo de Anthropic llama a Palantir como, oye, nuestra inteligencia artificial ayudó a matar a gente. Según informa el secretario de Defensa xHUB.AI, está cerca de clasificar a Anthropic como un riesgo para la cadena de suministro. Todos los contratistas de defensa deben certificar cero, bueno, que no tienen componentes de Anthropic o perderán contratos. El director ejecutivo, Dario Amodei, quiere medidas de protección para las armas autónomas y la vigilancia masiva de los estadounidenses. El Pentágono dice: todos los fines lícitos o nada. Les haremos pagar. Está sucediendo. Bueno. Y aquí la serie, que es muy similar a lo que ocurre, ¿no? Persona de interés con Jim Caviezel. Bueno. Lo que vamos a vivir, la que se está armando. Bueno, esto es el episodio 2, portadita del episodio 2 que hemos hecho diferente para diferenciarla de la del episodio 1. Los humanos monos mirando a la emergencia de la superinteligencia, ¿no? Estamos cerca del fin. Bueno, decimos dos cositas, venga, y continuamos con la entrevista, que es histórica. Este programa pertenece a la comunidad de Inteligencia Artificial y Ciencias Transversales de habla hispana xHUB.AI. Sexta temporada. Imparables, necesarios, más que nunca. Más ante la locura, algo voló sobre el nido del cuco, que va a ocurrir con la ola que viene de la inteligencia artificial. Intentaremos poner cordura o celebraremos una fiesta. O seremos pasto de las llamas de los medievos, quién sabe, ¿no? No, eso seguro que no. Si queréis uniros al Discord de la comunidad xHUB.AI, que está que echa humo, vamos para 600 miembros, pero bueno, es verdad que debería crecer más rápido. Fíjate que no sé por qué también no hacemos mucha publicidad, solo en los programas. Entiendo que hay sobresaturación de información, pero es que incluso gente que participa en xHUB o no estaba, yo digo, bueno, pero ¿cómo que no estáis en el Discord, ¿no? Pero vamos para 600 miembros, vamos a hacer meter caña para que este año podamos llegar, no sé si a los 1000, ¿no? Estaría bien, sería un número bonito. Bueno, si queréis entrar a la comunidad en el servidor de Discord de la comunidad de xHUB.AI, me enviáis un mensaje directo o un correo, os paso un enlace y estáis dentro. Y si os gusta lo que vais a ver, lo que estáis viendo, lo que conocéis, pues poned me gusta, compartid, comentad, suscribíos a YouTube o a iVoox o Spotify, que son dos de las plataformas en podcast que más éxito tenemos, que sabéis que en podcast somos número 1, estamos muy cerca ya, otra vez de volver. No voy a reiterarme en ese tema y bueno, pues apoyadnos todo lo que podáis, comentarios, etcétera. Reactivaremos la monetización. Tenéis en los comentarios todo el tema de si queréis apoyarnos económicamente. Hace tiempo que no lo he dicho, lo volveré a poner, porque antes cuando lo decía sí que había bueno, algún tipo de apoyo, que no fuera mucho, pero es que ahora es cero. Si no lo digo, cero, ¿no? Están los comentarios, por si queréis apoyarnos, porque la verdad es que es una auténtica locura el trabajo que lleva y estamos reflexionando a ver cómo podemos llevarlo a término, no solo lo que hacemos, sino más, porque tengo bastantes ideas al respecto y necesitamos bueno, toda la ayuda y apoyo posible, pero bueno, si no podéis apoyarnos económicamente, mínimo poner un me gusta y comentar lo buenos que somos. Siempre educadamente, que hay algunos comentarios. Bueno, yo he visto una mañana uno que ha empezado a decir, no sé qué, por lo de los comentarios, lo de los subtítulos en inglés, que lo he explicado 1000 veces. Los subtítulos en inglés no los voy a poner en castellano. ¿Cuál es el problema? ¿Que hago lo que quiero? Pues es el canal de xHUB y lo dirijo yo. ¿Cuál es el problema? ¿Cuál es el problema? ¿No te gusta? Pues otro canal. ¿Está? Pues es que no, pero de ahí al insulto, ¿no? Escucha, de verdad, un poquito de educación y respeto y buena energía, buena vibración. Venga, vamos a Vamos a seguir con la charla y vamos a ir analizando a medida que se produzca, ¿vale? Venga, vamos a...
Anthropic actually released a couple of papers about sleeper agents, and they showed that you can build a simple classifier on the residual stream to detect when a backdoor is about to fire. But they already knew what the triggers were because they built them. You don't, and it's not feasible to check the activations for all possible trigger phrases. Unlike the other puzzles they made for this podcast, Jane Street isn't even sure this one is solvable, but they've set aside $50,000 for the best attempts and write-ups. The puzzle's live at janestreet.com/Dwarkesh, and they're accepting submissions until April 1st. All right, back to Dario. You've told investors that you plan to be profitable starting in 2028. And this is the year where we're like potentially getting the country of geniuses as a data center. And this is like going to now unlock all this progress and medicine and health and et cetera, and new technologies. Wouldn't this be exactly the time where you'd like want to reinvest in the business and build bigger countries so they can make more discoveries?
So I mean, profitability is this kind of like weird thing in this field. I don't think in this field profitability is actually a measure of kind of spending down versus investing in the business. Like let's just take a model of this. I actually think profitability happens when you underestimated the amount of demand you were going to get, and loss happens when you overestimated the amount of demand you were going to get, because you're buying the data centers ahead of time. So think about it this way. Ideally, you would like, and again, these are stylized facts. These numbers are not exact for I'm just trying to make a toy model here. Let's say half of your compute is for training and half of your compute is for inference. And the inference has some gross margin that's like more than 50%. And so what that means is that if you were in steady state, you build a data center, if you knew exactly the demand you were getting, you would you would get a certain amount of revenue. Say, I don't know, let's say you pay $100 billion a year for compute, and on $50 billion a year, you support $150 billion of revenue, and the other $50 billion are used for training. So basically, you're profitable. You make $50 billion of profit. Those are the economics of the industry today, or sorry, not today, but like that's where we're projecting forward in a year or two. The only thing that makes that not the case is if you get less demand than 50 billion, then you have more than 50% of your data center for research, and you're not profitable. So you train stronger models, but you're like not profitable. If you get more demand than you thought, then your research gets squeezed. But you're kind of able to support more inference and you're more profitable. So it's maybe I'm not explaining it well, but the thing I'm trying to say is you decide the amount of compute first, and then you have some target desire of inference versus training, but that gets determined by demand. It doesn't get determined by you.
What I'm hearing is the reason you're predicting profit is that you are systematically underinvesting in compute, right? Because if you actually
no. I'm saying it's hard to predict. So these things about 2028 and when it will happen, that's our attempt to do the best we can with investors. All of this stuff is really uncertain because of the cone of uncertainty. Like we could be profitable in 2026 if the revenue grows fast enough, and then if we overestimate or underestimate the next year, that could swing wildly. Like I what I'm trying to get at is you have a model in your head of like the business invests, gets scale, and kind of then becomes profitable. There's a single point at which things turn around. I don't think the economics of this industry work that way.
I see. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying because of the discrepancy between the amount of compute we should have gotten and the amount of compute we got, we were like sort of forced to make profit. But that doesn't mean we're going to continue making profit. We're going to like reinvest the money because, well, now AI has made so much progress and we want the bigger country of geniuses. And so then back into revenue is high, but losses are also high.
If every year we predict exactly what the demand is going to be, we'll be profitable every year. Because spending 50% of your compute on 50% of your compute on research, roughly, plus a gross margin that's higher than 50%, and correct demand prediction leads to profit. That's the profitable business model that I think is kind of like there, but like obscured by these like building ahead and prediction errors.
I guess you're treating the 50% as a sort of like, just like a given constant.
Yes.
Whereas
Yes.
in fact, if AI progresses fast and you can increase the progress by scaling up more, you should just have more than 50% and not make profit.
Here's what I'll say. You might want to scale up it more. You might want to scale it up more, but remember the log returns to scale, right? If 70% would get you a very little bit of a smaller model through a factor of 1.4x, right? Like that extra $20 billion is that each dollar there is worth much less to you because the log linear setup. And so you might find that it's better to invest that $20 billion in serving inference or in hiring engineers who are kind of better at what they're doing. So the reason I said 50%, that's not exactly our target. It's not exactly going to be 50%. It'll probably vary over time. What I'm saying is the like log linear return, what it leads to is you spend of order one fraction of the business, right? Like not 5%, not 95%, and then you get diminishing returns because of the log.
I feel it's strange that I'm like convincing Dario to like believe in AI progress or something. But like, you don't invest in research because it has diminishing returns, but you invest in the other things you mentioned.
Again, we're talking about diminishing returns after you're spending $50 billion a year, right?
This is a point I'm sure you would make, but like diminishing returns on a genius could be quite high. And more generally, like what is profit in the market economy? Profit is basically saying the other companies in the market can like do more things with this money that I can't.
And put aside Anthropic. I'm just trying to like, because I don't want to give information about Anthropic is why I'm giving these stylized numbers, but like, let's just derive the equilibrium of the industry, right? I think so why doesn't everyone spend 100% of their 100% of their compute on training and not serve any customers, right? It's because if they didn't get any revenue, they couldn't raise money, they couldn't do compute deals, they couldn't buy more compute the next year. So there's going to be an equilibrium where every company spends less than 100% on training, and certainly less than 100% on inference. It should be clear why you don't just serve the current models and never train another model, because then you don't have any demand because you'll fall behind. So there's some equilibrium. It's not going to be 10%. It's not going to be 90%. Let's just say as a stylized fact, it's 50%. That's what I'm getting at. And I think we're going to be in a position where that equilibrium of how much you spend on training is less than the gross margins that you're able to get on compute. And so the underlying economics are profitable. The problem is you have this hellish demand prediction problem when you're buying the next year of compute, and you might guess under and be very profitable but have no compute for research, or you might guess over and you are not profitable and you have all the compute for research in the world. Does that make sense? Just as a dynamic model of the industry.
Maybe stepping back, I'm like, I'm not saying I think the country of geniuses is going to come in 2 years and therefore you should buy this compute. To me, what you're saying, the end conclusion you're arriving at makes a lot of sense, but that's because like, it seems like country of geniuses is hard and there's a long way to go. And so the stepping back, the thing I'm trying to get at is more like, it seems like your worldview is compatible with somebody who says, we're like 10 years away from a world in which like we're generating trillions of dollars.
That's just not my view.
Yeah.
That is not my view. Like so I'll make another prediction. It is hard for me to see that there won't be trillions of dollars in revenue before 2030. I can construct a plausible world. It takes maybe 3 years. So that would be the end of what I think it's plausible. Like in 2028, we get the real country of geniuses in a data center. The revenue's been going into the maybe is in the low hundreds of billions by 2028. And then the country of geniuses accelerates it to trillions, and we're basically on the slow end of diffusion. It takes 2 years to get to the trillions. That would be the world where it takes until 2030. I suspect even composing the technical exponential and diffusion exponential will get there before 2030.
So you laid out a model where Anthropic makes profit because it seems like fundamentally we're in a compute constrained world, and so it's like eventually we keep growing compute.
No, I think the way the profit comes is again, and let's just abstract the whole industry here. Like we have let's just imagine we're in like an economics textbook. Right. We have a small number of firms, each can invest a limited amount in, or like each can invest some fraction in R&D. They have some marginal cost to serve. The margins on that, the gross profit margins on that marginal cost are like very high because inference is efficient. There's some competition, but the models are also differentiated. There's some companies will compete to push their research budgets up, but like because there's a small number of players, we have what is it called? The Carnot equilibrium, I think, is what the small number of firm equilibrium is. The point is it doesn't equilibrate to perfect competition with zero margins. If there's three firms in the economy, all are kind of independently behaving rationally, it doesn't equilibrate to zero.
Help me understand that, because right now we do have three leading firms and they're not making profit. And so what is changing?
Yeah. So the gross margins right now are very positive. What's happening is a combination of two things. One is we're still in the exponential scale up phase of compute.
Yeah.
So what that means is we're training, like a model gets trained.
Yeah.
It costs, let's say a model got trained that costs $1 billion last year. And then this year, it produced $4 billion of revenue and cost $1 billion to inference from. So again, I'm using stylized number here, but that would be 75% gross margins and this 25% tax. So that model as a whole makes $2 billion. But at the same time, we're spending $10 billion to train the next model because there's an exponential scale up. And so the company loses money. Each model makes money, but the company loses money. The equilibrium I'm talking about is an equilibrium where we have the country of geniuses. We have the country of geniuses in the data center, but that model training scale up has equilibrated more. Maybe it's still going up. We're still trying to predict the demand, but it's more leveled out.
I'm confused a couple of things there. So let's start with the current world. In the current world, you're right that, as you said before, if you treat each individual model as a company, it's profitable. But
yes.
Of course, a big part of the production function of being a frontier lab is training the next model, right? So
yes,
if you didn't do that, then you'd make profit for 2 months. Then you wouldn't have margins because you wouldn't have the best model. And then you can make profits for 2 months in the current system.
At some point, that reaches the biggest scale that it can reach. And then in equilibrium, we have algorithmic improvements, but we're spending roughly the same amount to train the next model as we spent to train the current model.
So this equilibrium relies.
I mean, at some point, you run out of money in the economy.
A fixed lump of labor fallacy. The economy is going to grow, right? That's one of your predictions.
Well,
we're going to have
but this is
data centers in space.
But this is another example of the theme I was talking about, which is that the economy will grow much faster with AI than I think it ever has before. But it's not like right now, the compute is growing 3x a year.
Yeah.
I don't believe the economy is going to grow 300% a year. Like I said this in Machines of Love and Grace, like I think we may get 10 or 20% per year growth in the economy, but we're not going to get 300% growth in the economy. So I think in the end, if compute becomes the majority of what the economy produces, it's going to be capped by that.
So now let's assume a model where compute stays capped.
Yeah.
The world where frontier labs are making money is one where they continue to make fast progress, because fundamentally your margin is limited by how good the alternative is. And so you are able to make money because you have a frontier model. If you didn't have a frontier model, you wouldn't be making money.
Well,
and so this model requires there never to be a steady state. Like forever and ever, you keep making more algorithmic progress.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I feel like I feel like this is an economics, this is like an economics class.
Do you know the Tyler Cowen quote? We never stop talking about economics.
We never stop talking about economics. So no, but there are worlds in which so I don't think this field's going to be a monopoly. All my lawyers never want me to say the word monopoly. But I don't think this field's going to be a monopoly. But you get industries in which there are a small number of players, not one, but a small number of players. And ordinarily, like the way you get monopolies like Facebook or Meta, or I always call them Facebook, but is these kind of network effects. Yeah. The way you get industries in which there are a small number of players are very high costs of entry, right? Cloud is like this. I think cloud is a good example of this. You have 3, maybe 4 players within cloud. I think that's the same for AI. 3, maybe 4. And the reason is that it's so expensive. It requires so much expertise and so much capital to run a cloud company, right? And so you have to put up all this capital, and then in addition to putting up all this capital, you have to get all of this other stuff that requires a lot of skill to make it happen. And so it's like, if you go to someone and you're like, I want to disrupt this industry, here's $100 billion. You're like, okay, I'm putting $100 billion and also betting that you can do all these other things that these people have been doing.
Only to decrease the profit in the industry.
Yeah, and then the effect of your entering is the profit margins go down. So, we have equilibria like this all the time in the economy, where we have a few players. Profits are not astronomical, margins are not astronomical, but they're not zero, right? I think that's what we see on cloud. Cloud is very undifferentiated. Models are more differentiated than cloud, right? Like, everyone knows Claude is good at different things than GPT is good at, than Gemini is good at. And it's not just Claude's good at coding, GPT is good at, math and reasoning, it's more subtle than that. Like, models are good at different types of coding. Models have different styles. Like, I think these things are actually, quite different from each other. And so I would expect more differentiation than you see in cloud. Now, there actually is a counter. There is one counter argument, and that counter argument is that if all of that, the process of producing models, becomes if AI models can do that themselves, then that could spread throughout the economy. But that is not an argument for commoditizing AI models in general. That's kind of an argument for commoditizing the whole economy at once. I don't know what quite happens in that world where basically anyone can do anything, anyone can build anything, and there's no moat around anything at all. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we want that world. Like maybe that's the end state here. Like maybe when kind of AI models can do, when AI models can do everything, if we've solved all the safety and security problems, that's one of the mechanisms for just kind of the economy flattening itself again. But that's kind of far post country geniuses in the data center.
Maybe a finer way to put that potential point is, one, it seems like AI research is especially loaded on raw intellectual power, which will be especially abundant in a world with AGI. And 2, if you just look at the world today, there's very few technologies that seem to be diffusing as fast as AI algorithmic progress. And so that does hint that this industry is sort of structurally diffusive.
So I think coding is going fast, but I think AI research is a superset of coding, and there are aspects of it that are not going fast. But I do think, again, once we get coding, once we get AI models going fast, then AI, that will speed up the ability of AI models to kind of do everything else. So I think while coding is going fast now, I think once the AI models are building the next AI models and building everything else, the whole economy will kind of go at the same pace. I am worried geographically, though. I'm a little worried that just proximity to AI, having heard about AI, that may be one differentiator. And so when I said the 10 or 20% growth rate, a worry I have is that the growth rate could be 50% in Silicon Valley and, parts of the world that are kind of socially connected to Silicon Valley, and, not that much faster than its current pace elsewhere. And I think that'd be a pretty messed up world. So one of the things I think about a lot is how to prevent that.
Yeah. Do you think that once we have this country of geniuses as a data center, that robotics is sort of quickly solved afterwards? Because it seems like a big problem with robotics is that a human can learn how to teleoperate current hardware, but current AI models can't, at least not in a way that's super productive. And so if we have this ability to learn like a human, should it solve robotics immediately as well?
I don't think it's dependent on learning like a human. It could happen in different ways. Again, we could have trained the model on many different video games, which are like robotic controls, or many different simulated robotics environments, or just, train them to control computer screens and they learn to generalize. So it will happen. It's not necessarily dependent on human-like learning. Human-like learning is one way it could happen. If the model's like, oh, I pick up a robot, I don't know how to use it, I learn. That could happen because we discovered discovering continual learning. That could also happen because we trained the model on a bunch of environments and then it generalized, or it could happen because the model learns that in the context length. It doesn't actually matter which way. If we go back to the discussion we had like an hour ago, that type of thing can happen in several different ways.
Yeah.
But I do think when for whatever reason the models have those skills, then robotics will be revolutionized, both the design of robots, because the models will be much better than humans at that, and also the ability to kind of control robots. So we'll get better at building the physical hardware, building the physical robots, and we'll also get better at controlling it. Now, does that mean the robotics industry will also be generating trillions of dollars of revenue? My answer there is yes, but there will be the same extremely fast but not infinitely fast diffusion. So will robotics be revolutionized? Yeah, maybe tack on another year or two. That's the way I think about these
Makes
things.
sense. There's a general skepticism about extremely fast progress. Like here's my view, which is like, it sounds like you are going to solve continual learning one way or another within a matter of years. But just as people weren't talking about continual learning a couple years ago, and then we realized, oh, why aren't these models as useful as they could be right now, even though they are clearly passing the Turing test and are experts in so many different domains? Maybe it's this thing. And then we solve this thing and we realize, actually, there's another thing that human intelligence can do, and that's a basis of human labor that these models can't do. And then, so why not think there will be more things like this? So I think that like, we've like found the pieces of human intelligence.
Well, to be clear, I mean, I think continual learning, as I've said before, might not be a barrier at all, right? Like, I think we maybe just get there by pre-training generalization and RL generalization. Like, I think there just might not be, there basically might not be such a thing at all. In fact, I would point to the history in ML of people coming up with things that are barriers that end up kind of dissolving within the big blob of compute, right? That, people talked about, how do you have, how do your models keep track of nouns and verbs, and, how do they, they can understand syntactically, but they can't understand semantically. It's only statistical correlations. You can understand a paragraph, but you can't understand a word. There's reasoning. You can't do reasoning, but then suddenly it turns out you can do code and math very well at all. So I think there's actually a stronger history of some of these things seeming like a big deal and then kind of dissolving. Some of them are real. I mean, the need for data is real. Maybe continual learning is a real thing. But again, I would ground us in something like code. Like, I think we may get to the point in like a year or two where the models can just do SWI end to end. Like, that's a whole task. That's a whole sphere of human activity that we're just saying the models can do it now.
When you say end to end, do you mean setting technical direction, understanding the context of the problem,
yes,
and et cetera?
Yes,
okay.
Yes,
So,
I mean all of that.
Interesting. I mean, that is, I feel like AGI complete, which maybe is internally consistent, but it's not like saying 90% of code or 100% of code. It's like, no, the other parts of the job as well.
No, I gave this spectrum, 90% of code, 100% of code, 90% of end-to-end SWI, 100% of end-to-end SWI. New tasks are created for SWIs. Eventually, those get done as well. But it's a long spectrum there. But we're traversing the spectrum very quickly.
Yeah. I do think it's funny that I've seen a couple of podcasts you've done where the host will be like, but Dwarkesh wrote this essay about the continual learning thing, and it always makes me crack up because you're like, you've been an AI researcher for like 10 years, and I'm sure there's like some feeling of like, okay, so a podcaster wrote an essay, and then like every interview I get asked about it.
The truth of the matter is that we're all trying to figure this out together.
Yeah.
Right. There are some ways in which I'm able to see things that others aren't. These days, that probably has more to do with like, I can see a bunch of stuff within Anthropic and have to make a bunch of decisions than I have any great research insight that others don't, right? I'm running a 2,500 person company. Like it's actually pretty hard for me to have concrete research insight, much harder than it would have been, 10 years ago or even 2 or 3 years ago.
As we go towards a world of a full drop-in remote worker replacement, does a API pricing model still make the most sense? And if not, what is the correct way to price AGI or serve AGI?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a bunch of different business models here, sort of all at once, that are going to be experimented with. I actually do think that the API model is more durable than many people think. One way I think about it is if the technology is kind of advancing quickly, if it's advancing exponentially, what that means is there's always kind of like a surface area of kind of new use cases that have been developed in the last 3 months. And any kind of product surface you put in place is always at risk of sort of becoming irrelevant, right? Any given product surface probably makes sense for a range of capabilities of the model, right? The chatbot is already running into limitations of, making it smarter doesn't really help the average consumer that much. But I don't think that's a limitation of AI models. I don't think that's evidence that, the models are good enough and they're them getting better doesn't matter to the economy. It doesn't matter to that particular product. And so I think the value of the API is the API always offers an opportunity, very close to the bare metal to build on what the latest thing is. And so there's kind of always going to be this, this kind of front of new startups and new ideas that weren't possible a few months ago and are possible because the model is advancing. And so I kind of actually predict that it's going to exist alongside other models, but we're always going to have the API business model because there's always going to be a need for 1,000 different people to try experimenting with the model in a different way, and 100 of them become startups, and 10 of them become big successful startups, and 2 or 3 really end up being the way that people use the model of a given generation. So I basically think it's always going to exist. At the same time, I'm sure there's going to be other models as well. Like not every token that's output by the model is worth the same amount. Think about, what is the value of the tokens that are like, that the model outputs when someone, calls them up and says, my Mac isn't working or something, the model's like, restart it, right?
Yeah.
And like, someone hasn't heard that before, but like, the model said that like 10 million times, right? That maybe that's worth like $1 or a few cents or something. Whereas if the model goes to one of the pharmaceutical companies and it says, this molecule you're developing, you should take the aromatic ring from that end of the molecule and put it on that end of the molecule. And if you do that, wonderful things will happen. Like those tokens could be worth, tens of millions of dollars, right? So I think we're definitely going to see business models that recognize that, at some point we're going to see, pay for results or, in some form, or we may see forms of compensation that are like labor, that kind of work by the hour. I don't know. I think because it's a new industry, a lot of things are going to be tried, and I don't know what will turn out to be the right thing.
What I find, I take your point that people will have to try things to figure out what is the best way to use this blob of intelligence. But what I find striking is Claude Code. So I don't think in the history of startups there has been a single application that has been as hotly competed in as coding agents. and Claude Code is a category leader here, and that seems surprising to me. Like, it doesn't seem intrinsically like Anthropic had to build this. And I wonder if you have an accounting of why it had to be Anthropic, or how Anthropic ended up building an application in addition to the model underlying it.
Yeah, so it actually happened in a pretty simple way, which is we had our own, we had our coding models, which were good at coding. And around the beginning of 2025, I said, I think the time has come where you can have non-trivial acceleration of your own research if you're an AI company, by using these models. And of course, you need an interface, you need a harness to use them. And so I encourage people internally, I didn't say this is one thing that, that you have to use. I just said people should experiment with this. And then, this thing, I think it might have been originally called Claude CLI, and then the name eventually got changed to Claude Code internally, was the thing that kind of everyone was using, and it was seeing fast internal adoption. And I looked at it and I said, probably we should launch this externally, right? It's seen such fast adoption within Anthropic, coding is a lot of what we do, and so we have a audience of many hundreds of people that's in some ways at least representative of the external audience. So it looks like we already have product market fit. Let's launch this thing, and then we launched it, and I think just the fact that we ourselves are kind of developing the model, and we ourselves know what we most need to use the model, I think it's kind of creating this feedback loop.
I see. In the sense that let's say a developer at Anthropic is like, it would be better if it was better at this X thing. And then you bake that into the next model that you build.
That's one version of it, but then there's just the ordinary product iteration of we have a bunch of coders within Anthropic, they use Claude Code every day, and so we get fast feedback. That was more important in the early days. Now, of course, there are millions of people using it, and so we get a bunch of external feedback as well. But it's it's just great to be able to get fast internal feedback. I think this is the reason why we launched a coding model and didn't launch a pharmaceutical company, right? My background's in biology, but we don't have any of the resources that are needed to launch a pharmaceutical company.
So there's been a ton of hype around OpenClaw, and I want to check it out for myself. I've got a day coming up this weekend, and I don't have anything planned yet. So I gave OpenClaw a Mercury debit card. I set a couple $100 limit, and I said, surprise me. Okay, so here's the Mac Mini it's on, and besides having access to my Mercury, it's totally quarantined. And I actually felt quite comfortable giving it access to a debit card because Mercury makes it super easy to set up guardrails. I was able to customize permissions, cap the spend, and restrict the category of purchases. I wanted to make sure the debit card worked, so I asked OpenClaw to just make a test transaction, and decided to donate a couple bucks to Wikipedia. Besides that, I have no idea what's gonna happen. I will report back on the next episode about how it goes. In the meantime, if you want a personal banking solution that can accommodate all the different ways that people use their money, even experimental ones like this one, visit mercury.com/personal. Mercury is a fintech company, not an FDIC insured bank. Banking services provided through Choice Financial Group and Column NA, members FDIC. She thinks we're getting coffee and walking around the neighborhood. Let me ask you about now making AI go well. It seems like whatever vision we have about how AI goes well has to be compatible with two things. One is the ability to build and run AIs is diffusing extremely rapidly. And two is that the population of AIs, the amount we have and their intelligence, will also increase very rapidly. And that means that lots of people will be able to build huge populations of misaligned AIs or AIs which are just like companies which are trying to increase their footprint or have weird psyches like Sydney Bing, but now they're superhuman. What is a vision for a world in which we have an equilibrium that is compatible with lots of different AIs, some of which are misaligned, running around?
Yeah. So I think, in the adolescence of technology, I was kind of, skeptical of the balance of power. But I think I was particularly skeptical of, the thing I was specifically skeptical of is you have 3 or 4 of these companies kind of all building models that are kind of derived, derived from the same thing, and that these would check each other, or even that kind of, any number of them would check each other. Like we might live in a offense dominant world where, like one person or one AI model is like smart enough to do something that like causes damage for everything else. I think in the short run, we have a limited number of players now, so we can start by within the limited number of players, we need to put in place the safeguards. We need to make sure everyone does the right alignment work. We need to make sure everyone has bioclassifiers. Like, those are kind of the immediate things we need to do. I agree that, that doesn't solve the problem in the long run, particularly if the ability of AI models to make other AI models proliferates, then, the whole thing can kind of, can become harder to solve. I think in the long run, we need some architecture of governance, right? Some architecture of governance that preserves human freedom, but kind of also allows us to govern the very large number of kind of human systems, AI systems, hybrid human hybrid human AI, companies or economic units. So, we're going to need to think about how do we protect the world against, bioterrorism? How do we protect the world against mirror life? Probably we're going to need to, need some kind of AI monitoring system that kind of monitors for all of these things. But then we need to build this in a way that preserves civil liberties and our constitutional rights. So I think just as is anything else, it's like a new security landscape with a new set of, a new set of tools and a new set of vulnerabilities. And I think my worry is if we had 100 years for this to happen all very slowly, we'd get used to it. We've gotten used to the presence of explosives in society, or the presence of various new weapons, or the presence of video cameras. We would get used to it over 100 years, and we'd develop governance mechanisms. We'd make our mistakes. My worry is just that this is happening all so fast. And so I think maybe we need to do our thinking faster about how to make these governance mechanisms work.
Yeah. It seems like in an offense-dominant world, over the course of the next century, so the idea is the AI is making the progress that would happen over the next century happen in some period of 5 to 10 years. But we would still need the same mechanisms, or balance of power would be similarly intractable, even if humans were the only game in town. And so I guess we have the advice of AI. It fundamentally doesn't seem like a totally different ballgame here. If checks and balances were going to work, they would work with humans as well. If they aren't going to work, they wouldn't work with AIs as well. And so maybe this just dooms human checks and balances as well. But
again, I think there's some way to make this happen. The governments of the world may have to work together to make it happen. You may have to talk to AIs about kind of, building societal structures in such a way that these defenses are possible. I don't know. I mean, this is I don't want to say so far ahead in time, but so far ahead in technological ability that may happen over a short period of time that it's hard for us to anticipate it in advance.
Speaking of governments getting involved, on December 26th, the Tennessee legislature introduced a bill which said, quote, it would be an offense for a person to knowingly train artificial intelligence to provide emotional support, including through open-ended conversations with the user. And of course, one of the things that Claude attempts to do is be a thoughtful friend, thoughtful, knowledgeable friend. And in general, it seems like we're going to have this patchwork of state laws. A lot of the benefits that normal people could experience as a result of AI are going to be curtailed, especially when we get into the kinds of things you discuss in Machines of Love and Grace, biological freedom, mental health improvements, et cetera, et cetera. It seems easy to imagine worlds in which these get whack-a-moled away by different laws. Whereas bills like this don't seem to address the actual existential threats that you're concerned about. So I'm curious to understand, in the context of things like this, your Anthropic's position against the federal moratorium on state AI laws.
Yes. So I don't know. There's many different things going on at once, right? I think that particular law is dumb. I think it was clearly made by legislators who just probably had little idea what AI models could do and not do. They're like, AI models serving as that just sounds scary. Like I don't want that to happen. So we're not in favor of that, right? But that wasn't the thing that was being voted on. The thing that was being voted on is we're going to ban all state regulation of AI for 10 years with no apparent plan to do any federal regulation of AI, which would take Congress to pass, which is a very high bar. So the idea that we'd ban states from doing anything for 10 years, and people said they had a plan for federal government, but there was no proposal on the table. There was no actual attempt. Given the serious dangers that I lay out in Adolescence of Technology around things like the kind of biological weapons and bioterrorism, autonomy risk, and the timelines we've been talking about, like 10 years is an eternity. Like I think that's a crazy thing to do. So if that's the choice, if that's what you force us to choose, then we're gonna choose not to have that moratorium. And I think the benefits of that position exceed the costs, but it's not a perfect position if that's the choice. Now, I think the thing that we should do, the thing that I would support, is the federal government should step in, not saying states you can't regulate, but here's what we're going to do, and states you can't differ from this, right? Like, I think preemption is fine in the sense of saying that federal government says, here's our standard, this applies to everyone, states can't do something different. That would be something I would support if it would be done in the right way. But this idea of states you can't do anything and we're not doing anything either, that struck us as very much not making sense, and I think will not age well. Is already starting to not age well with all the backlash that you've seen. Now, in terms of what we would want, I mean, the things we've talked about are starting with transparency standards, in order to monitor some of these autonomy risks and bioterrorism risks. As the risks become more serious, as we get more evidence for them, then I think we could be more aggressive in some targeted ways and say, hey, AI bioterrorism is really a threat. Let's pass a law that kind of forces people to have classifiers. And I could even imagine, it depends. It depends how serious a threat it ends up being. We don't know for sure. Then we need to pursue this in an intellectually honest way where we say ahead of time, the risk has not emerged yet. But I could certainly imagine with the pace that things are going that, I could imagine a world where later this year we say, hey, this AI bioterrorism stuff is really serious. We should do something about it. We should put it in a federal standard. And if the federal government won't act, we should put it in a state standard. I could totally see that.
I'm concerned about a world where if you just consider the pace of progress you're expecting, the life cycle of legislation, the benefits are, as you say, because of diffusion lag, the benefits are slow enough that I really do think this patchwork on the current trajectory, this patchwork of state laws would prohibit, having an emotional chatbot friend is something that freaks people out. Then just imagine the kinds of actual benefits from AI we want normal people to be able to experience, from improvements in health and health span and improvements in mental health and so forth. Whereas at the same time, it seems like you think the dangers are already on the horizon, and I just don't see that much. It seems like it would be especially injurious to the benefits of AI as compared to the dangers of AI. And so that's maybe where the cost benefit makes less sense to me.
So there's a few things here, right? People talk about there being thousands of these state laws. First of all, the vast majority of them do not pass. And the world works a certain way in theory, but like just because a law has been passed doesn't mean it's really enforced, right? The people implementing it may be like, oh my God, this is stupid. It would mean shutting off everything that's ever been built in Tennessee. So very often laws are interpreted in a way that makes them that makes them not as dangerous or not as harmful. On the same side, of course, you have to worry if you're passing a law to stop a bad thing, you had this problem as well.
Yeah.
Look, my basic view is, if we could decide, what laws were passed and how things were done, which, we're only one small input into that, I would deregulate a lot of the stuff around the health benefits of AI. I think, I don't worry as much about the kind of chatbot laws. I actually worry more about the drug approval process, where I think AI models are going to greatly accelerate the rate at which we discover drugs, and just the pipeline will get jammed up. Like the pipeline will not be prepared to like process all of the stuff that's going through it. So, I think reform of the regulatory process to bias more towards, we have a lot of things coming where the safety and the efficacy is actually going to be really crisp and clear. Like, I mean, a beautiful thing, really, really crisp and clear, and like really, really effective. But, and maybe we don't need all this superstructure around it that was designed around an era of drugs that barely work and often have serious side effects. But at the same time, I think we should be ramping up quite significantly the this kind of safety and security legislation. And, like I've said, starting with transparency is my view of trying not to hamper the industry, right? Trying to find the right balance. I'm worried about it. Some people criticize my essay for saying that's too slow. The dangers of AI will come too soon if we do that. Well, basically, I kind of think like the last 6 months and maybe the next few months are going to be about transparency. And then if these risks emerge when we're more certain of them, which I think we might be as soon as later this year, then I think we need to act very fast in the areas that we've actually seen the risk. Like, I think the only way to do this is to be nimble. Now, the legislative process is normally not nimble, but we need to emphasize to everyone involved the urgency of this. That's why I'm sending this message of urgency, right? That's why I wrote Adolescence of Technology. I wanted policymakers to read it. I wanted economists to read it. I want national security professionals to read it. I want decision makers to read it so that they have some hope of acting faster than they would have otherwise.
Is there anything you can do or advocate that would make it more certain that the benefits of AI are better instantiated, where I feel like you have worked with legislatures to be like, okay, we're going to prevent bioterrorism here away. We're going to increase transparency. We're going to increase whistleblower protection. And I just think by default, the actual, the things we're looking forward to here, it just seems very easy. They seem very fragile to different kinds of moral panics or political economy problems.
Yeah, I don't actually, so I don't actually agree that much in the developed world. I feel like, in the developed world, like markets function pretty well. And when there's like a lot of money to be made on something and it's clearly the best available alternative, it's actually hard for the regulatory system to stop it. We're seeing that in AI itself, right? Like a thing I've been trying to fight for is export controls on chips to China, right? And like, that's in the national security interests of the US. Like, that's like square within the policy beliefs of, almost everyone in Congress of both parties. But I think the case is very clear. The counter arguments against it are, I'll politely call them fishy. And yet it doesn't happen. And we sell the chips because there's so much money. There's so much money riding on it. That money wants to be made. And in that case, in my opinion, that's a bad thing. But it also applies when it's a good thing. And so I don't think that if we're talking about drugs and benefits of the technology, I am not as worried about those benefits being hampered in the developed world. I am a little worried about them going too slow. And as I said, I do think we should work to speed the approval process in the FDA. I do think we should fight against these chatbot bills that you're describing, right? Described individually, I'm against them. I think they're stupid. But I actually think the bigger worry is a developing world, where we don't have functioning markets, where we often can't build on the technology that we've had. I worry more that those folks will get left behind. And I worry that even if the cures are developed, maybe there's someone in rural Mississippi who doesn't get it as well, right? That's a kind of smaller version of the concern we have in the developing world. And so the things we've been doing are, we work with philanthropists, right? We work with folks who deliver, medicine and health interventions to developing world, to sub-Saharan Africa, India, Latin America, other developing parts of the world. That's the thing I think that won't happen on its own.
You mentioned export controls.
Yeah.
Why can't the U.S. and China both have a country of geniuses on a data center?
Why can't, why won't it happen, or why shouldn't
why shouldn't it happen?
Why shouldn't it happen? I think if this does happen, then we kind of have we could have a few situations. If we have like an offense dominant situation, we could have a situation like nuclear weapons, but like more dangerous, right? Where it's like, kind of either side could easily destroy everything. We could also have a world where it's unstable. Like the nuclear equilibrium is stable, right? Because it's like deterrence. But let's say there were uncertainty about like if the two AIs fought, which AI would win. That could create instability, right? You often have conflict when the two sides have a different assessment of their likelihood of winning, right? If one side is like, oh yeah, there's a 90% chance I'll win, and the other side's like, there's a 90% chance I'll win, then a fight is much more likely. They can't both be right, but they can both think that.
But this seems like a fully general argument against the diffusion of AI technology, that's the implication of this world.
Let me just go on, because I think we will get diffusion eventually. The other concern I have is that the governments will oppress their own people with AI, and so I'm worried about some world where you have a country that's already there's a government that kind of already is kind of building a high-tech authoritarian state. And to be clear, this is about the government. This is not about the people. Like people, we need to find a way for people everywhere to benefit. My worry here is about governments. So yeah, my worry is if the world gets carved up into two pieces, one of those two pieces could be authoritarian or totalitarian in a way that's very difficult to displace. Now, will governments eventually get powerful AI? And there's risk of authoritarianism. Yes. Will governments eventually get powerful AI? And there's risk of kind of bad equilibria. Yes, I think both things. But the initial conditions matter, right? At some point we're going to need to set up the rules of the road. I'm not saying that one country, either the United States or a coalition of democracies, which I think would be a better setup, although it requires more international cooperation than we currently seem to want to make. But I don't think a coalition of democracies or certainly one country should just say these are the rules of the road. There's going to be some negotiation, right? The world is going to have to grapple with this. And what I would like is that the democratic nations of the world, those with whose governments represent closer to pro-human values, are holding a stronger hand. Then have more leverage when the rules of the road are set. And so I'm very concerned about that initial condition.
I was re-listening to an interview from 3 years ago, and one of the ways it aged poorly is that I kept asking questions, assuming there was going to be some key fulcrum moment 2 to 3 years from now, when in fact, being that far out, it just seems like progress continues, AI improves, AI is more diffused, and people will use it for more things. It seems like you're imagining a world in the future where the countries get together and here's the rules of the road and here's the leverage we have, here's the leverage you have. When it seems like on current trajectory, everybody will have more AI. Some of that AI will be used by authoritarian countries. Some of that within the authoritarian countries will be used by private actors versus state actors. It's not clear who will benefit more. It's always unpredictable to tell in advance. It seems like the internet privileged authoritarian countries more than you would have expected. And maybe the AI will be the opposite way around. So I want to better understand what you're imagining here.
Yeah. So just to be precise about it, I think the exponential of the underlying technology will continue as it has before, right? The models get smarter and smarter. Even when they get to country of geniuses in a data center, I think you can continue to make the model smarter. There's a question of like getting diminishing returns on their value in the world, right? How much does it matter after you've already solved human biology, or at some point you can do harder math, you can do more abstruse math problems, but nothing after that matters. But putting that aside, I do think the exponential will continue, but there will be certain distinguished points on the exponential, and companies, individuals, countries will reach those points at different times. And so, there's could there be some, I talk about, is a nuclear deterrent still in adolescence of technology, is a nuclear deterrent still stable in the world of AI? I don't know, but that's an example of like one thing we've taken for granted, that like the technology could reach such a level that it's no longer like, we can no longer be certain of it, at least. Think of others. There are kind of points where if you reach a certain point, you have offensive cyber dominance, and like every computer system is transparent to you after that, unless the other side has a kind of equivalent defense. So I don't know what the critical moment is, or if there's a single critical moment, but I think there will be either a critical moment, a small number of critical moments, or some critical window where it's like AI confers some large advantage from the perspective of national security, and one country or coalition has reached it before others. I'm not advocating that they're just like, okay, we're in charge now. That's not how I think about it. That there's always the other side is catching up. There's extreme actions you're not willing to take, and it's not right to take complete control anyway. But at the point that happens, I think people are going to understand that the world has changed, and there's going to be some negotiation, implicit or implicit, about what is the post AI world order look like, and I think my interest is in making that negotiation be one in which classical liberal democracy has a strong hand.
Well, I want to understand what that better means, because you say in the essay, quote, "Autocracy is simply not a form of government that people can accept in the post-powerful AI age." And that sounds like you're saying the CCP as an institution cannot exist after we get AGI. And that seems like a very strong demand, and it seems to imply a world where the leading lab or the leading country will be able to, and by that language should, get to determine how the world is governed, or what kinds of governments are allowed and not allowed.
Yeah. So when I believe that paragraph was, I think I said something like, you could take it even further and say X. So I wasn't necessarily endorsing that I wasn't necessarily endorsing that view. I was saying like, here's a weaker thing that I believe. I think I said, we have to worry a lot about authoritarians, right, and we should try and kind of check them and limit their power. Like, you could take this kind of further, much more interventionist view that says like authoritarian countries with AI are these these kind of self-fulfilling cycles that are very hard to displace, and so you just need to get rid of them from the beginning. That has exactly all the problems you say, which is if you were to make a commitment to overthrowing every authoritarian country, I mean, they would take a bunch of actions now that that could lead to instability. So that may or that just may not be possible. But the point I was making that I do endorse is that it is quite possible that, today, the view, or at least my view, or the view in most of the Western world is democracy is a better form of government than authoritarianism. But it's not like if a country's authoritarian, we don't react the way we reacted if they committed a genocide or something, right? And I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little worried that in the age of AGI, authoritarianism will have a different meaning. It will be a graver thing, and we have to decide one way or another how to deal with that. And the interventionist view is one possible view. I was exploring such views. It may end up being the right view. It may end up being too extreme to be the right view. But I do have hope, and one piece of hope I have is we have seen that as new technologies are invented, forms of government become obsolete. I mentioned this in Adolescence of Technology, where I said, like feudalism was basically, like a form of government, right? And then when we invented industrialization, feudalism was no longer sustainable. It no longer made sense.
Why is that hope? Why, couldn't that imply that democracy is no longer going to be a competitive system?
It could, right. It could go either way, right? But these problems with authoritarianism, right? That the problems with authoritarianism get deeper. I wonder if that's an indicator of other problems that authoritarianism will have, right? In other words, because authoritarianism becomes worse, people are more afraid of authoritarianism. They work harder to stop it. It's more of like, you have to think in terms of total equilibrium, right? I just wonder if it will motivate new ways of thinking about with the new technology how to preserve and protect freedom, and even more optimistically, will it lead to a collective reckoning and a kind of a more emphatic realization of how important some of the things we take as individual rights are, right? A more emphatic realization that we really can't give these away. We've seen there's no other way to live that actually works. I am actually hopeful that I guess one way to say it sounds too idealistic, but I actually believe it could be the case is that dictatorships become morally obsolete. They become morally unworkable forms of government, and that the crisis that creates is sufficient to force us to find another way.
I think there is genuinely a tough question here, which I'm not sure how you resolve. And we've had to come out one way or another on it through history, right? So with China in the 70s and 80s, we decided, even though it's an authoritarian system, we will engage with it. And I think in retrospect, that was the right call because it stayed an authoritarian system, but 1 billion plus people are much wealthier and better off than they would have otherwise been. And it's not clear that it would have stopped being an authoritarian country otherwise. You can just look at North Korea as an example of that, right? And I don't know if that takes that much intelligence to remain an authoritarian country that continues to coalesce its own power. And so you can just imagine a North Korea with an AI that's much worse than everybody else's, but still enough to keep power. And then, so in general, it seems like, should we just have this attitude of the benefits of AI will, in the form of all of these empowerments of humanity and health and so forth, will be big. And historically, we have decided it's good to spread the benefits of technology widely, even to people whose governments are authoritarian. And I guess it is a tough question how to think about it with AI, but historically, we have said, yes, this is a positive sum world, and it's still worth diffusing the technology.
Yeah, so there are a number of choices we have. I think framing this as a kind of government-to-government decision and in national security terms, that's like one lens, but there are a lot of other lenses. Like, you could imagine a world where, we produce all these cures to diseases, and like, the cures to diseases are fine to sell to authoritarian countries. The data centers just aren't, right? The chips and the data centers just aren't. And the AI industry itself. Like another possibility is, and I think folks should think about this, like, could there be developments we can make either that naturally happen as a result of AI or that we could make happen by building technology on AI? Could we create an equilibrium where it becomes infeasible for authoritarian countries to deny their people kind of private use of the benefits of the technology? Are there equilibria where we can kind of give everyone in an authoritarian country their own AI model that kind of like defends themselves from surveillance, and there isn't a way for the authoritarian country to like crack down on this while retaining power? I don't know. That sounds to me like if that went far enough, it would be a reason why authoritarian countries would disintegrate from the inside. But maybe there's a middle world where like there's an equilibrium where if they want to hold on to power, the authoritarians can't deny kind of individualized access to the technology. But I actually do have a hope for the more radical version, which is, is it possible that the technology might inherently have properties, or that by building on it in certain ways, we could create properties that have this kind of dissolving effect on authoritarian structures. Now, we hoped originally, right, if we think back to the beginning of the Obama administration, we thought originally that social media and the internet would have that property, and turns out not to. But I don't know. What if we could What if we could try again with the knowledge of how many things could go wrong and that this is a different technology? I don't know that it would work, but it's worth a try.
Yeah. I think it's just it's very unpredictable. Like there's first principles reasons why authoritarianism might be privileged.
It's all very unpredictable. Yeah. I don't think. I mean, we got to recognize the problem, and then we got to come up with 10 things we can try, and we got to try those, and then assess whether they're working or which ones are working, if any, and then try new ones if the old ones aren't.
But I
working.
guess what that nets out to today is you say we will not sell data centers. Or sorry.
A ver, no me lo volváis a preguntar. Lo del doblado en español, que ya lo sé que se puede ver doblado en español en el canal de Duarques o como se llame, pero yo lo pongo en el lenguaje, en el idioma original, porque el doblado es una basura. Y el subtítulo en español, no sé por qué, no va. Y pongo el inglés para que al menos se pueda leer. Quien quiera verlo en español, pues que se vaya al canal y lo vea en el idioma que controle.
The ability to make chips to China.
Si estáis aquí es por verlo conmigo y luego por hacer un análisis, debatirlo, comentarlo, etc. Es que estáis siempre con lo mismo. Parece que sois una IA sin continual learning, macho.
And so in some sense, you are denying there would be some benefits to the Chinese economy, Chinese people, et cetera, because we're doing that. And then there'd also be benefits to the American economy because it's a positive-sum world. We could trade. They could have their country data centers doing one thing. We could have ours doing another. And already you're saying it's not worth that positive-sum stipend to empower those countries.
What I would say is that, we are about to be in a world where growth and economic value will come very easily if we're able to build these powerful AI models. Growth and economic value will come very easily. What will not come easily is distribution of benefits, distribution of wealth, political freedom. These are the things that are going to be hard to achieve. And so when I think about policy, I think that the technology and the market will deliver all the fundamental benefits, almost faster than we can take them. And that these questions about distribution and political freedom and rights are the ones that will actually matter and that policy should focus on.
Okay, so speaking of distribution, as you're mentioning, we have developing countries, and in many cases, catch-up growth has been weaker than we would have hoped for. But when catch-up growth does happen, it's fundamentally because they have underutilized labor, and we can bring the capital and know-how from developed countries to these countries, and then they can grow quite rapidly.
Yes.
Obviously, in a world where labor is no longer the constraining factor, this mechanism no longer works. And so is the hope basically to rely on philanthropy from the people who immediately get wealthy from AI or from the countries that get wealthy from AI? What is the hope for?
I mean, philanthropy should obviously play some role as it has, as it has in the past. But I think growth is always better and stronger if we can make it endogenous.
Yeah.
So, what are the relevant industries in an AI driven world? Look, there's lots of stuff, there's, I said we shouldn't build data centers in China, but there's no reason we shouldn't build data centers in Africa, right? In fact, I think it'd be great to build data centers in Africa. As long as they're not owned by China, we should build data centers in Africa. I think that's a great thing to do. We should also build, there's no reason we can't build a pharmaceutical industry that's like AI driven. Like, if AI is accelerating drug discovery, then, there will be a bunch of biotech startups. Like, let's make sure some of those happen in the developing world. And certainly during the transition, I mean, we can talk about the point where humans have no role, but humans will still have some role in starting up these companies and supervising the AI models. So let's make sure some of those humans are humans in the developing world so that fast growth can happen there as well.
You guys recently announced Quad is going to have a constitution that's aligned to a set of values and not necessarily just to the end user. And there's a world you can imagine where if it is aligned to the end user, it preserves the balance of power we have in the world today because everybody gets to have their own AI that's advocating for them. And so the ratio of bad actors to good actors stays constant. It seems to work out for our world today. Why is it better not to do that, but to have a specific set of values that the AI should carry forward?
So I'm not sure I'd quite draw the distinction in that way.
Yeah.
There may be two relevant distinctions here, which are, I think you're talking about a mix of the two. Like, one is, should we give the model a set of instructions about do this versus don't do this?
Yeah.
And the other, versus should we give the model a set of principles for kind of how to act? And there it's kind of purely a practical and empirical thing that we've observed that by teaching the model principles, getting it to learn from principles, its behavior is more consistent, it's easier to cover edge cases, and the model is more likely to do what people want it to do. In other words, if you're like, don't tell people how to hotwire a car, don't speak in Korean, if you give it a list of rules, it doesn't really understand the rules, and it's kind of hard to generalize from them. If it's just kind of a list of do's and don'ts. Whereas if you give it principles, and then it has some hard guardrails like don't make biological weapons, but overall you're trying to understand what it should be aiming to do, how it should be aiming to operate. So just from a practical perspective, that turns out to be just a more effective way to train the model. That's one piece of it. So that, it's the kind of rules versus principles trade-off. Then there's another thing you're talking about, which is kind of like the corrigibility versus I would say kind of intrinsic motivation trade-off, which is like, how much should the model be a kind of, I don't know, like a skin suit or something where, you just kind of, it just kind of directly follows the instructions that are given to it by whoever is giving it those instructions, versus how much should the model have an inherent set of values and go off and do things on its own. And there, I would actually say everything about the model is actually closer to the direction of like, it should mostly do what people want. It should mostly follow these. We're not trying to build something that goes off and runs the world on its own. We're actually pretty far on the corrigible side. Now what we do say is there are certain things that the model won't do, right? That it's like, I think we say it in various ways in the Constitution, that under normal circumstances, if someone asks the model to do a task, it should do that task. That should be the default. But if you've asked it to do something dangerous, or if you've asked it to to kind of harm someone else, then the model is unwilling to do that. So I actually think of it as like a mostly corrigible model that has some limits, but those limits are based on principles.
Yeah, I mean, then the fundamental question is, how are those principles determined? And this is not a special question for Anthropic. This would be a question for any AI company. But because you have been the ones to actually write down the principles, I get to ask you this question. Normally, a constitution is like, you write it down, it's set in stone, and there's a process of updating it and changing it and so forth. In this case, it seems like a document that people at Anthropic write that can be changed at any time, that guides the behavior of systems that are going to be the basis of a lot of economic activity. What is how do you think about how those principles should be set?
Yes. So I think there's maybe three kind of sizes of loop here, right?
Yeah.
Three ways to iterate. One is we iterate within Anthropic, we train the model, we're not happy with it, and we kind of change the Constitution. Yeah. And I think that's good to do. And, putting out publicly, making updates to the Constitution every once in a while, saying, here's a new Constitution.
Right.
I think that's good to do because people can comment on it. The second level of loop is different companies will have different constitutions. And, I think it's useful for like Anthropic puts out a constitution, and, the Gemini model puts out a constitution, and, other companies put out a constitution, and then they can kind of look at them, compare. Outside observers can critique and say, this, I like this one, this thing from this constitution and this thing from that constitution. And then kind of that creates some kind of, soft incentive and feedback for all the companies to like take the best of each elements and improve. Then I think there's a third loop, which is, society beyond the AI companies and beyond just those who kind of, who comment on the constitutions without hard power. And there, we've done some experiments, like, a couple years ago, we did an experiment with, I think it was called the Collective Intelligence Project, to like, to basically poll people and ask them what should be in our AI constitution. I think at the time we incorporated some of those changes. And so you could imagine with the new approach we've taken to the Constitution, doing something like that. It's a little harder because it's like, that was actually an easier approach to take when the Constitution was like a list of do's and don'ts. at the level of principles, it has to have a certain amount of coherence. But you could still imagine getting views from a wide variety of people. And I think you could also imagine, and this is like a crazy idea, but hey, this whole interview is about crazy ideas, right? So, you could even imagine systems of kind of representative government having input, right? Like, I wouldn't do this today because the legislative process is so slow. Like, this is exactly why I think we should be careful about the legislative process and AI regulation. But there's no reason you couldn't, in principle, say like, all AI models have to have a constitution that starts with like these things, and then like you can append other things after it, but like there has to be this special section that like takes precedence. I wouldn't do that. That's too rigid. That sounds that sounds kind of overly prescriptive in a way that I think overly aggressive legislation is. But like that is a thing you could, that is a thing you could try to do. Is there some much less heavy-handed version of that? Maybe.
I really like control loop 2, where obviously this is not how constitutions of actual governments do or should work, where there's not this vague sense in which the Supreme Court will feel out how people are feeling and what are the vibes, and then update the Constitution accordingly. So there's with actual governments, there's a more procedural
formal process.
Yeah, exactly. But you actually have a vision of competition between constitutions, which is actually very reminiscent of how some libertarian charter cities people used to talk about what an archipelago of different kinds of governments could look like, and then there would be selection among them of who could operate the most effectively, in which place people would be the happiest. And in a sense, there's this vision.
I'm kind of recreating that.
Yeah, like this like utopia of archipelagos.
Again, I think that vision has if things to recommend it and things that will kind of go wrong with it. I think it's an interesting, in some ways compelling vision, but also things will go wrong with it that you hadn't imagined. So, I like loop 2 as well, but I feel like the whole thing has got to be some mix of loops 1, 2, and 3, and it's a matter of the proportions, right? I think that's got to be the answer.
When somebody eventually writes the equivalent of the making of the atomic bomb for this era, what is the thing that will be hardest to glean from the historical record that they're most likely to miss?
I think a few things. One is, at every moment of this exponential, the extent to which the world outside it didn't understand it. This is a bias that's often present in history, where anything that actually happened looks inevitable in retrospect. And so, I think when people look back, it will be hard for them to put themselves in the place of people who were actually making a bet on this thing to happen that wasn't inevitable, that we had these arguments, like the arguments that, that I make for scaling, or that continual learning will be solved. Some of us internally in our heads put a high probability on this happening, but it's like there's a world outside us that's not acting on that's not kind of not acting on that at all. And I think the weirdness of it, I think unfortunately, like the insularity of it, like, if we're 1 year or 2 years away from it happening, like the average person on the street has no idea. And that's one of the things I'm trying to change, like with the memos, with talking to policymakers. But like, I don't know. I think that's just like a crazy thing.
Yeah.
Finally, I would say, and this probably applies to almost all historical moments of crisis, how absolutely fast it was happening, how everything was happening all at once. And so decisions that you might think, were kind of carefully calculated, well, actually you have to make that decision, and then you have to make 30 other decisions on the same day, because it's all happening so fast. And you don't even know which decisions are going to turn out to be consequential. So, one of my, I guess, worries, although it's also an insight into kind of what's happening, is that, some very critical decision will be some decision that, someone just comes into my office and is like, Dario, you have 2 minutes. Like, should we do thing A or thing B on this, like, someone gives me this random, half page memo and is like, should we do A or B? And I'm like, I don't know, I have to eat lunch. Let's do B. And that ends up being the most consequential thing ever.
So final question. it seems like you have, there's not tech CEOs who are usually writing 50-page memos every few months. And it seems like you have managed to build a rule for yourself and a company around you, which is compatible with this more intellectual type role as CEO. And I want to understand how you construct that and how does that work to be, you just go away for a couple of weeks and then you tell your company, this is the memo, like, here's what we're doing. It's also reported you write a bunch of these internally.
Yeah. So, I mean, for this particular one, I wrote it over winter break.
Yeah.
So there was the time, and I was having a hard time finding the time to actually write it. But I actually think about this in a broader way. I actually think it relates to the culture of the company. So I probably spend a third, maybe 40% of my time making sure the culture of Anthropic is good. As Anthropic has gotten larger, it's gotten harder to just, get involved in directly involved in the training of the models, the launch of the models, the building of the products. Like, it's 2,500 people. It's there's just, I have certain instincts, but there's only, it's very difficult to get involved in every single detail. I try as much as possible. But one thing that's very leveraged is making sure Anthropic is a good place to work. People like working there. Everyone thinks of themselves as team members. Everyone works together instead of against each other. And, we've seen as some of the other AI companies have grown, without naming any names, we're starting to see decoherence and people fighting each other. And, I would argue there was even a lot of that from the beginning, but that it's gotten worse. But I think we've done an extraordinarily good job, even if not perfect, of holding the company together, making everyone feel the mission, that we're sincere about the mission, and that, everyone has faith that everyone else there is working for the right reason, that we're a team, that people aren't trying to get ahead at each other's expense or backstab each other, which again, I think happens a lot at some of the other places. And how do you make that the case? I mean, it's a lot of things. It's me, it's Daniela, who, runs the company day to day. It's the co-founders, it's the other people we hire, it's the environment we try to create. But I think an important thing in the culture is the other leaders as well, but especially me, have to articulate what the company is about, why it's doing what it's doing, what its strategy is, what its values are, what its mission is, and what it stands for. And, when you get to 2,500 people, you can't do that person by person. You have to write, or you have to speak to the whole company. This is why I get up in front of the whole company every 2 weeks and speak for an hour. It's actually, I wouldn't say I write essays internally. I do two things. One, I write this thing called a DVQ, Dario Vision Quest. I wasn't the one who named it that. That's the name it received, and it's one of these names that I tried to fight it because it made it sound like I was going off and smoking peyote or something. But the name just stuck. So I get up in front of the company every 2 weeks. I have a 3 or 4 page document, and I just kind of talk through 3 or 4 different topics about what's going on internally, the models we're producing, the products, the outside industry, the world as a whole as it relates to AI and geopolitically in general, just some mix of that. And I just go through very, very honestly. I just go through and I just say, this is what I'm thinking. This is what Anthropic leadership is thinking. And then I answer questions. And that direct connection, I think, has a lot of value that is hard to achieve when you're passing things down the chain, six levels deep. And large fraction of the company comes to attend either in person or virtually. And it really means that you can communicate a lot. And then the other thing I do is I just, I have a channel in Slack where I just write a bunch of things and comment a lot. And often that's in response to, just things I'm seeing at the company or questions people ask, or we do internal surveys and there are things people are concerned about. And so I'll write them up. And I'm very honest about these things. I just say them very directly. And the point is to get a reputation of telling the company the truth about what's happening, to call things what they are, to acknowledge problems, to avoid the sort of corpo speak, the kind of defensive communication that often is necessary in public because, the world is very large and full of people who are, interpreting things in bad faith. But if you have a company of people who you trust, and we try to hire people that we trust, then you can really just be entirely unfiltered. I think that's an enormous strength of the company. It makes it a better place to work. It makes people more the sum of their parts, and increases the likelihood that we accomplish the mission, because everyone is on the same page about the mission, and everyone is debating and discussing how best to accomplish the mission.
Well, in lieu of an external Dario Vision quest, we have this interview.
This interview is a little like that.
This has been fun, Dario. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Dwarkesh.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, the most helpful thing you can do is just share it with other people who you think might enjoy it.
Bueno, me ha parecido... Para verla en castellano. A ver, venga, vamos a hacerle un repaso porque, a ver, bueno, esto es opinión personal, ¿no? A mí me parece, Dario Amodei me parece un auténtico coñazo. Me cuesta mucho hacer programas sobre él. Su artículo sí que me pareció bueno, es decir, los dos. Pero es verdad, la de las Loving Grace y la de la adolescencia de la tecnología. Incluso la Constitución tiene partes interesantes, pero Dario Amodei como CEO, de verdad que me echa para atrás. Me lo tengo que decir, porque me echa auténticamente para atrás. Este tío está desconectado de la realidad. Y este tío tiene un doble juego que no se lo traga a nadie. A ver, no tiene suficiente ni carisma, ni personalidad, ni la inteligencia para gestionar eso. Se le ve a leguas. Me pongo a temblar. Bueno, vamos a ir viendo lo que ha ido diciendo. Bueno, sobre el modelo de negocio de estas empresas, Big Techs y inteligencia artificial, obviamente su prioridad no va a ser dar beneficios, ni a corto plazo. ¿Quién está soportando eso? La propia economía de Estados Unidos. Obviamente que no puede permitir que eso que sea una burbuja. Bueno, pueden caer algunas, pero no va a dejar. ¿Ese fenómeno podría darse en España o en Europa? Ni de coña. Obviamente no. ¿Por qué no se puede dar? Porque nosotros no pintamos nada como imperios, como nación que define proyecto o civilizatorio o cultura. Marco Rubio ya fue a Europa a decir lo que hay. No sé si visteis la ponencia. Dice que para 2030 sí, que pueden haber trillones de beneficio y en 2028 se esperan low hundred of billions, pocos cientos pero miles de billones. Bueno, es mucho, ¿no? La verdad es que es mucho, ¿no? Pero bueno, está claro que el crecimiento de facturación y de éxito de esta compañía, una compañía como Anthropic, imaginad si no lo fuerais. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Que realmente esto ya es un tecnofeudalismo. ¿Esto es un tecnofeudalismo de Estados Unidos o un tecnofeudalismo de China? No, porque luego entrará en el tema de los modelos de gobernanza y qué es lo que va a quedar caduco, ¿no? Poca autocrítica tiene Dario Amodei, no con lo que hace en su compañía, sino hacia afuera. Yo creo que no es como Sam Altman, no es gente preparada para un liderazgo a ese nivel. Para mí Elon Musk sí. Gustará más o menos, pero sí que tiene esa capacidad. Yo le veo con esa capacidad. Demis Hassabis, pues hombre, mejor que esto sí, pero lo mismo, no es un líder en ese nivel, es un científico liderando la IA. Habla de la importancia del código, ¿no? Es decir, al final él dice, bueno, todo el debate que existe, que si razona, si no razona, si piensa, si entiende sintácticamente, semánticamente, que evidentemente ellos son conocedores los primeros, ¿no? Dice, al final, si nosotros somos capaces de solventar o de ser muy óptimos en el código, aquí, el cuadro falta, que me están comentando aquí. ¿Qué me dicen por aquí? Estoy en tiempo real. Ya voy a hacer en tiempo real, eso total. Están comentando lo de DeepSeek, el V4, las filtraciones que existen. Bueno, hablan sobre el tema del código, ¿no? Y que si somos capaces de ser muy buenos en código, seremos capaces de ser buenos en todo. Ya lo comentaba Demis Hassabis, siendo bueno en código y matemáticas es el lenguaje de la lógica, es el lenguaje de la realidad, de nuestra, de nuestra existencia, ¿no? Es decir, ¿qué lenguaje más descriptivo existe que la matemática y la programación? Entonces, si somos capaces de ser muy buenos en eso, pues bueno, se solucionará todo, como dice él, ¿no? Y yo estoy de acuerdo con él, ¿eh? Hay algo que subyace, ¿no? Quizá hay un código de la realidad y esos dos lenguajes estén más próximos, ¿no? Entonces, una vez mejorado esa parte, se mejora todo. Además, hay pruebas sobre ello, ¿no? También una gran ignorancia sobre ello, obviamente. De la robótica habla poco, porque ahí Anthropic no está muy metido, ¿no? Como puede ser Google o incluso la propia OpenAI o xAI. Ahí Anthropic está liderando a partir del tema del código, pero claro, tendrá que abarcar más, ¿no? Pero bueno, está tocando educación, está tocando cloud work con un montón de sectores, agentes, bueno, tiene expansión en ese sentido, ¿no? Pero quizá una visión más limitada que pueda tener xAI o que Google o que incluso la propia OpenAI, ¿no? Habla del continual learning, que ya hemos hablado sobre ello, y habla del tema de la importancia del código y de llegar al final a una solución de software engineer que sea end-to-end, de principio a fin, 100% IA. Hay un gran debate sobre esto. No molestéis más con el tema del debate de la programación. Los programadores que os habéis endiosado, yo soy programador de toda la vida, como muchos de vosotros, amantes de la programación, pero el mundo de la programación está cambiando y va a cambiar. Os veo asustados, os veo temerosos. El mundo, la vida cambia y todo lo que veis aquí también desaparecerá cuando un día nos vayamos al otro lado. Es decir, yo no sé qué tanto miedo. ¿Miedo a qué? ¿Volvemos a la cueva o tenéis miedo de qué tenéis miedo? Dice Dario Amodei, que es un CEO de una compañía de 2.500 personas, que bueno, que es complicado, 2.500 es un número importante. Habla del modelo de API, que es pues estable, durable, ¿no? ¿Qué he notado aquí? Luego, cuando terminan de hablar del tema del código, se ponen a hablar sobre a qué mundo vamos, ¿no? Habla de la importancia del balance o del equilibrio de poder, pero claro, vamos a un equilibrio de poder entre China y Estados Unidos, pero el resto del mundo, bueno, ha hablado luego de África. Es decir, es que es Estados Unidos y sus enemigos y sus aliados. No existe nada más, no hay una visión real del mundo. La visión que tiene Estados Unidos es monoteísta, entre comillas, que se me entienda, ¿no? Habla de una cosa importante que sí que me ha parecido importante y es la arquitectura de la gobernanza, ¿no? Cuando haya un sistema o haya múltiples sistemas que estén como peleándose entre ellos, haya igualdad o no haya igualdad, pues es importante que haya una arquitectura de gobernanza de estos sistemas multiagentes. Claro, es que si no lo hay, si es la guerra, bueno, entre China y Estados Unidos, porque es que nosotros no vamos a pintar nada. Si realmente ahí no hay unas reglas que se establezcan, que se negocien, si no hay una gobernanza común, pues vamos a tener un problema, ¿no? Dice que esto tiene que permitir crear nuevos sistemas humanos estas arquitecturas de gobernanza lo que tienen que permitir es que estos sistemas humanos y sistemas de inteligencia artificial, es decir, estos sistemas híbridos, coexistan, ¿no? Y haya una coherencia, unas reglas. Bueno, lo que le faltaba a Europa. Europa estará con los ojos como platos. Hoy hay reglas, regulación, normas, y están todos con la corbata y aplaudiendo la de la laca, ¿no? Sí, hablan de, bueno, una regulación, ¿no?, sobre el tema de utilizar las inteligencias artificiales como un chat afectivo que tenga emociones, que lo están prohibiendo, ¿no? Y él dice que esto es una regulación dumb, desastrosa, que no tienen ni idea, que lo hacen los reguladores, pues bueno, que se lo diga a Europa. Y hace un llamamiento a algo que dijo Trump, que es 10 años sin ningún tipo de regulación, para que pudieran acelerar con el tema de la inteligencia artificial. ¿Entendéis la diferencia? Guste más o menos Trump, al final dicen 10 años sin regulación, a full la IA. No podemos perder la ola, tenemos que liderarla. En Europa no, es que nosotros no producimos IA, pero la vamos a liderar la IA regulando lo que no producimos y lo que producen otros y siendo vamos a regular los robots que vengan y los agentes que vengan. Somos los imbéciles de la película. Y encima aplaudimos la regulación, los reguladores. Vamos a dejar un legado que tela marinera, macho. Como no espabilemos. Pero este año va a ser el del despertar. En impacto, tanto en positivo como en negativo, en negocio como en un impacto humano doloroso y dramático, ¿no? Habla, como no, de los riesgos que él refleja en ese artículo que es histórico y que tenéis que leer, que desde luego aburre menos que Darío. A mí me aburre mucho este tío, lo he dicho. Ese artículo de adolescencia de la tecnología sí que me parece un artículo imperdible y que tiene reflexiones y otro ritmo. A mí no puedo con los tics de Darío. El único momento que me gustó fue con Demis Hassabis en Davos. Habla de la importancia que de la transparencia, de que van a aplicarlo, de que aunque vayan lentos en este sentido, pues bueno, van al ritmo que consideran o pueden, pero el tema de la transparencia para ellos es fundamental. Si aparecen los riesgos a medida que van haciendo esto, pues ya verán lo que hacen, ¿no? Ya irán viendo, ¿no? Y habla de la posibilidad que igual que está haciendo Estados Unidos, que es un data center o un país con data centers lleno de genios, pues China puede hacer lo mismo, ¿no? Claro, porque es que esto lo venden como si fueran los únicos. Y qué bonito es Anthropic y aplaudir, pero es que ahora hay un mundo global y resulta que China puede hacer lo mismo o mejor. Y encima está haciendo una guerra, una AI Wars, la guerra de la inteligencia artificial, ofreciendo modelos igual de potentes o más de forma open source. ¿Quién va a comprar estos modelos si tienes el equivalente en open source? No, es que no estarán certificados. Entonces esto es una oligarquía, esto es un feudo joder, no me sale. Vamos, un feudalismo tecnológico, coño, no me salía. Un feudalismo tecnológico, pero dictatorial. Ya han elegido directamente Europa, España, bueno, ya tengo que decir África, países de Latinoamérica, el resto de países, todos tenemos que comprar sus productos para que ellos sean países ricos del primer mundo, proyecto civilizatorio cohete, y nosotros tenemos la burra, ¿no? Que compre sus productos. Pero es que eso no es un mundo. Pues no lo había oído, si eso es cierto. Dicen por aquí. Bueno, ahora pondré cosas del chat. Ahora pongo los mensajes del chat, ¿vale? Habla de la guerra de inteligencias artificiales, ¿no? Pero principalmente de dos. Acordaos del relato de AI 2027, del ex de OpenAI, se llama, o lo voy a pronunciar bien porque si no, de Cocotaclo, de Daniel Cocotaclo principalmente, y ya habla de esta guerra dual de inteligencias artificiales. Está muy claro que la guerra no es de muchos países o de agrupación de países democráticos. Se podría abrir una tercera vía, no europea, sino hispana, ¿no? Hispana. Pero no dejarían esa tercera vía. Entonces, pues, si hay una guerra Estados Unidos-China, pues entiendo que llegará a un acuerdo para que el mundo no se vaya a la mierda y para usted contar. Pero eso que defienden como alianzas de países democráticos, a ellos les importa una puta mierda lo que nosotros pensemos y hagamos. Y bueno, y si hiciéramos algo bueno o mejor que ellos, bueno, estaríamos directamente declarados como enemigos. En un sentido y en el otro, ¿eh? Quizá China utilice otra estrategia, como siempre ha hecho, y Estados Unidos otra. Le hace una pregunta que me gusta mucho, que no sabe ni qué contestar, porque es que a Darío se le ve. Dice, bueno, entonces cuando llegue la H, el partido CPE, el Partido Comunista Chino, no debería existir, ¿no? Bueno, claro, es que entonces, hombre, aquí cuando llegara la H o la ASI, habrían formas de gobierno obsoletos. Ya, pero tú dices China, porque es el enemigo. Entonces sería el comunismo. Estoy de acuerdo. Pero tú no te ves. Las democracias, le pregunta, ¿y las democracias? Lo primero que dijo Sam Altman es que lo que caducaría o llegaría al fin, si llegara la H, es el capitalismo. ¿A qué mundo vamos? A un tecnofeudalismo, a un nuevo comunismo, pero peor, vamos, el feudalismo pagaba menos. Con empresas únicas en el mundo que solo pueden desarrollar la tecnología que moverá esa nueva realidad. No, ahí no vas a poder competir. ¿Cómo vas a poder competir empezando de cero con qué? ¿Con Google en IA vas a poder competir? ¿O con China con alguno de los laboratorios? No. Esas empresas podrás trabajar con ellas o dedicarte a otra cosa. Habla que, bueno, esto es muy inocente por parte de Dario Amodei, que dice, bueno, hombre, yo lo que confío es que estos países que sean autoritarios y malos, ¿sabes? Que sean el enemigo, lo que hagan es desintegrarse internamente. Es decir, que como van a ser tan malos, la gente internamente va a luchar y van a hacer que estos países se desintegren. Como en España, ¿no? ¿Esto que lo dice por España? Dice si es interesante construir un data centers en África. Bueno, eso no lo valoran nunca, ¿no? Siempre dicen que ahora en el espacio, pero podrían hacer data centers en España, podrían hacer en Europa, en África, no sé, en países pobres o no tan pobres. Bueno, en Argentina van a hacer, ¿no? Hay un acuerdo ahí con Milei. Está obsesionado este hombre con la Fundación Gates, ¿no? Y con las farmacéuticas. Se le ve. A mí este tío tiene la misma personalidad. Para mí es un perfil de vendido al poder, totalmente. Que tiene que vender un buenismo, pero al final, cuando le pidan que se lo baje, se lo va a bajar. Y se lo va a pensar. Habla de la creación de la Constitución y que, bueno, debería haber varias líneas de... Varios Big Techs deberían tener su propia Constitución y podríamos debatir cada una de ellas, que al final la Constitución se puede ver desde 3 puntos de vista, la de Anthropic, obviamente, la de las compañías que lo utilizan y los operadores y la sociedad, ¿no? Podríamos ir hacia esa inteligencia colectiva, como decía Dario Amodei, ¿no? Están haciendo bien las cosas en Anthropic. A mí no me gusta su CEO, pero no es que no me parezca un tipo brillante y lo será porque está ahí, ¿no? Pero vamos, no me gusta él ni me gusta Sam Altman. Habla sobre la comparación de la bomba atómica y bueno, poco dice, vuelve otra vez a escurrir el bulto. Y vamos a ver el chat, a ver qué decís por aquí. Venga, a ver, bombardearme preguntas, venga. A ver, Ed Morales dice que OpenAI ficha al creador de OpenCloud. Tienen miedo tanto que lo fiche de seguro, quiere parar el crecimiento de OpenCloud. O lo quieren parar o quieren hacer lo suyo. Vamos a dedicarle, creo que el miércoles, un programa a OpenCloud y derivados, donde hablaremos de la adquisición de OpenAI, de OpenCloud por parte de OpenAI. Bueno, de su ingeniero más bien, pero bueno. Un saludo, Eduardo. Bueno, mucha gente en el chat. Qué pereza ponerse a estudiar la certificación de Kubernetes después de ver estas charlas. Mejor sería que me dedicase a la carpintería. Bueno, a la fontanería, a la electricidad, todo eso va a dar bastante pasta. A ver, Farlam dice interesante, llegará un momento en que la inteligencia artificial será tan inteligente que no podremos limitarla. Puedes tener la más inteligente o la que haga lo que le indicas, pero no ambas. Me da esperanzas. Eso va a ser el dilema. De ahí que os he comentado al principio del programa, ¿no? Lo de que Cloud 4.6, bueno, Opus 4.6 se ha declarado como un riesgo para la seguridad. Bueno, y además noticias ahí. Bueno, Va a pasar algo, en algún momento algo pasará que habrá una reflexión mundial. No sé si será un evento dirigido o provocado, no lo sé, pero Joseph74, que te contesto lo que me preguntes. Siempre os contesto a todos con cariño. Hoy no es que esté enfadado ni nada hoy. Tiene un día tela. Pero tela, me he pensado hacer el programa y todo, pero yo digo, esto hay que acabarlo porque hay un montón de programas y es que esto es una locura. Es una auténtica locura. Entonces vamos a ir más a saco. Comentando, quiero hacer programas de Michael Levine, de Blaise Agüera esta semana. Es creo de Dario Amodei. Vamos a ir un poquito más al tema de pensar, investigación, etcétera, porque esta gente. Lo de Gork no, lo de Grok será, ¿no? Gork, no, será Grok de X. Ya tiene su propio token DRB en la red de base. No lo sabía porque en el tema de cripto no estoy muy metido. A ver, Grok token, a ver cuál es. Grok token. No, aquí esto, ¿qué coño? No sé, yo no tengo ni idea, pero lo he puesto y no sale nada de lo que comentas. No lo sé, pero obviamente el futuro pasa por ahí, ¿no? Pasa por que los agentes tengan su propia wallet y utilicen tokens o criptomonedas propias o los fabricantes, como fue Libra. ¿Alguien se acuerda de Libra, de aquel proyecto de Meta? Súper interesante, lo tumbaron. No interesaba, demasiado poder para Meta. La verdad es que sí. Yo creo que la concentración de poder, debemos ir, como dice mi amigo, que lo vamos a tener pronto, a Tomás Prieto. Debemos ir a sistemas descentralizados. Ahora, ¿nos van a dejar ir hacia sistemas descentralizados? Pues no lo sé. Yo creo que no. ¿Podría haber una guerra entre libertad, sistemas descentralizados y concentración de poder a medida que las IAs de este tipo de empresas avancen? Puede ser. Utilizando modelos chinos, puede ser. Sería una guerra de inteligencia artificial, AI Wars, vamos, donde Europa no sabemos dónde quedaría. ¿Dónde quedaría Europa? ¿Dónde quedaría Europa? Europa no sabe definirse, no sabe si, como dice Marco Rubio, el destino de Europa es el destino el de Estados Unidos es el de Europa y el de Europa el de Estados Unidos. En definitiva, novios para siempre. Lo hemos sido. Quizás es momento de cambiar o no, o de ser independientes, o de jugar a dos bazas. Yo no sé qué pensáis. Pero bueno, ha sido la charla de Dario Amodei, me ha gustado mucho al principio, pero esta segunda parte ha sido un poco coñazo, la verdad. Porque este hombre no sale vamos, no se va a mojar. Defiende su compañía y punto, y no tiene la capacidad para ir más allá. Ya lo hizo en el artículo, en los 2 artículos que ha hecho, que bastante ha hecho. Tiene a su empresa liderando el mercado de la IA gracias a toda la parte de código, de ingeniería de software, y eso es mucho. Y ahora vive un momento dulce y tampoco está el hombre para cagarla, ¿no? Y eso de que Anthropic es una compañía que todo el mundo está a gusto trabajando, bueno, digo, hace poco el jefe de seguridad dimitió. Bueno, claro, es que volvemos a lo mismo. Siempre dicen lo bueno y nunca lo malo. Por lo tanto, ¿quién se cree muchas veces a esta gente? Nadie se las cree. Lo único que hacen es contar cuentos. Entonces, cuando hacen una entrevista, bueno, vamos a quedarnos con algunas cositas. Pero al final poco se sabe de la verdad porque estamos hablando con CEOs de compañías que pueden saber. No tienen por qué no saber. Mira, Ilya Suskever, ¿no? CEO. Bueno, amigos, ya hemos terminado con el programa de Dario Amodei, el análisis, esa entrevista en inglés. Lo siento, los que queráis en español. Mañana habrá doble programa. Mañana hay un debate sobre el futuro del trabajo y el Foro Económico Mundial, y también haré alguno, seguramente me apetece el de Blaise Agüera. No, el de Blaise Agüera no, era otra cosa, era el de Open Cloud Respira. Bueno, no os lo perdáis ese, a las 3:30. Open Cloud Respira, vais a flipar. Venga, amigos, como mañana tenéis 2 programas, nos vamos a despedir, vamos a hacer este más corto, pero mañana dos pedazos de programas. Y vamos a descansar un poquito de Dario Amodei, no de Anthropic, porque son modelos los mejores para mí, de los mejores, sobre todo en el tema de código, pues que se puede decir, pero bueno, estaremos también pendientes de los modelos chinos, Kimi, DeepSeek y bueno, Minimax, bueno, todos los modelos que han salido. Bueno, David Vivancos nos comentaba uno que decía que era muy bueno. Venga, lo voy a buscar porque se nos ha escapado. La verdad es que no sé si es por el nombre, pero venga, voy a decirlo y no vamos. Voy a ver, tenéis que seguir a David Vivancos, amigo, gran persona. A ver, David Vivancos, que puso aquí que es muy útil en las publicaciones estas que hace. A ver, y puso uno que dijo que era como, estaba en la número 2, pero no lo conocía ni Dios. Bueno, sí que la conocía porque lo habían dicho que estaba muy bien, pero no es de las Step Fan. Este es el número 2. Para él el ranking es... venga, vamos a compartirle. Venga, vamos a hacerle un poco de publicidad a David. Esto merece una paella, ¿eh? Otra paellita ahí. Buena, David. Venga, tenéis ahí el ranking de David, seguidlo porque hace un trabajo excelente. Y es un placer siempre pues, leer sus libros y escucharlo, ¿no? Un montón de canales y entrevistas que hace también en xHUB.AI. Dice que el primero es Anthropic, el modelo 4.6 Opus, el segundo Stepfan, modelo Flash, Step 3.5 Flash, el mejor en cuanto a pasta para OpenCloud, ZI, GLM5, el Kimi con Química 2.5 es en tercera posición, cuarta para Google DeepMind, la versión 3.1, cuarta para Codex 5.3, luego quinto Grok, quinto empatado, pone por aquí Qwen, sexto DeepSeek, séptimo Minimax M21, luego octavo Anti-International con Link and Ring, son modelos Xiaomi. Bueno, como veis, luego Meituan. Bueno, aquí David gana China. Bueno, aquí tenemos también el amigo Eduardo. Bueno, China, cuidado con China. Bueno, cuidado con China, no ahora. Hace tiempo. Y bueno, este año ya os digo que va a ser la leche. Preparaos para la aceleración, preparaos para el impacto, preparaos para el what the fuck, preparaos para los medievos de las antorchas, preparaos para la polarización y los debates llegando al insulto. Lo siento, pero van a ser así, porque la gente está muy nerviosa y van a defender paradigmas y posturas medievales. Nosotros en xHUB, como siempre, estaremos o lo intentaremos estar en la vanguardia, en crear un espacio de pensamiento crítico, en traer siempre mucho talento, profesionales para que den la opinión y luego vosotros, cada cual, busque su propia verdad, conocimiento, aunque verdad solo hay una, pero busque su conocimiento, su camino y seamos aquí pues un canal en el que podáis informaros y debatir y pensar. Venga, va, esta anécdota de Alex. Bueno, no sé, todo lo que lea lo cojo con piezas, pero bueno, dice Alexa KM2ZI, dice, Meituan es una empresa de comida china, creo. Me sorprende. Bueno, a lo mejor no es de comida china, pero como son la hostia, ¿no? En cuanto a capital, se han puesto a hacer modelos de IA y han sacado un modelo que es la hostia. Bueno, yo no lo sé, pero es curioso, ¿no? Seguid a David y investigarlo. Yo lo desconozco, ya te digo que hay modelos ahí que no conocía para nada. Un abrazo a todos, amigos. Graciosa la anécdota de empresa de comida china Meituan haciendo modelos de IA y además buenos modelos. Entiendo que si hacen buenos modelos de IA también harán buena comida. Venga, nos vemos mañana con 2 super programas. Un abrazo a todos y gracias por estar ahí, que ha habido mucha gente. Un abrazo.